All right, back with another stream. This is for June 6th, 2025. Just waiting a second here for the Instagram stream to catch up, and then I'll get started on the Gladio book. Okay. All right, so picking back up on the Gladio book. We left off yesterday talking about Charles Siragusa and other BNDD agents, how they were sent to Sicily, and they were ordered to haunt the deported gangster that's Charles Lucky Luciano. No, sorry, that's just Lucky Luciano. They were to track this guy and see what was going on, but he was also protected. Siragusa pressed for an arrest, but no action was taken by the Italian government or by the U.S. State Department. Lucky's work in Sicily, the BNDD was informed, remained a matter of national security. So, high level protected, Lucky Luciano was. So the next section here is Italian election tactics. So again, this is for that very important election of 1948, where the Communist Party of Italy actually stood a really good chance. Was pretty much set to win, if not for the involvement of these deep state agencies, this whole clandestine thing going on. So, Italian election tactics. In the closing months of 1947, hundreds of the mafia's made men began to arrive in Italy from New York, Chicago, and Miami to aid Luciano and Don Carlo in addressing the communist problem. The CIA's black money for mob muscle was paid out by paid out by the Vatican Bank from ecclesiastical organizations, including Catholic Action. In this way, the Holy See forged an alliance with the Sicilian mafia, an alliance that would strengthen throughout the next 3 decades. Wild. That's crazy. Like, they just started this, and then, yeah, I mean, that alone is just a wild claim. This alliance between the Vatican and the mafia that would only grow over the next 3 decades. Good morning, people. Checking if this is coming through on all the streams. Looks like it's working. So the force of the mafia was now unleashed upon the Italian electorate. Don Carlo and an army of thugs, including Vito Genovese's cousin Giovanni Genovese, burned down 11 communist branch offices and made 4 assassination attempts on the communist leader Girolamo Licauzi. The gang under Frank Coppola, who had been imported from Detroit by Angleton to work with Sicilian bandit Salvatore Giuliano, also opened fire on a crowd of workers celebrating May Day in Portella della Ginestra, killing 11 and wounding 57. Wow. That's crazy. Like, this. So that's the other thing that we will see over and over again with the Gladio operation is, like, especially when we get into like the years of lead, the amount of just like out and out terrorist activity that was conducted by agents of the U.S. state, people in the mafia, people who were affiliated with any of these orgs that are involved in this, and then no accountability ever, because often it's blamed on left wing people. That was the whole, like, talk about false flag operations. That was what they did, was did a whole bunch of terrorist shit, murdered innocent random people, murdered labor organizers, murdered left wing people, and then anything that was done that they couldn't explain, or that needed explanation in the news or whatever, it would be blamed on left wing activists, on anarchists, on left wing terrorism, and it was literally agents of the state doing this stuff. So yeah, the gang under Frank Coppola. I'm going to read that one more time. Who had been imported from Detroit by Angleton. This is James Jesus Angleton, the CIA agent, to work with Sicilian bandit Salvatore Giuliano, also opened fire on a crowd of workers celebrating May Day in Portella della Ginestra, killing 11 and wounding 57. The funds for the massacre were provided by Wild Bill Donovan through his World Commerce Corporation. And then all these numbers that are after these are all footnotes. You can, like, click through to this document and you can see all the footnotes and the sources for all of this stuff. This is like one of the most well-sourced books I've ever read. One of Italy's leading labor organizers, Placido Rizzotto, was found dead at the bottom of a cliff, legs and arms chained, and a bullet through his brain. Throughout 1948, in Sicily alone, the CIA-backed terror attacks resulted in the killing of on average 5 people a week. So yeah, I'm not exaggerating here when I say there's a lot of terrorist activity, a lot of assassinations and murders. Again, that's footnote 72 for that last sentence there. Like, the Vatican Death Squad. There's another section here. Anybody piping up in the chat? Anything? Morning, Chibbles. Good to see you. So, the Vatican Death Squad. In addition to these undertakings, Monsignor Don Giuseppe Bicchieri, acting upon papal authority, assembled a terror gang charged with the task of beating up communist candidates, smashing left-wing political gatherings, and intimidating voters. The money, guns, and jeeps from the Monsignor's terror attacks were furnished by the CIA from surplus World War II stockpiles. On election day, Don Carlo and his men stuffed ballot boxes and bribed voters with gifts of freshly laundered drug money, while Pope Pius remained within his chambers, quote, hunched up, almost physically overcome by the weight of his present burden, the coming election. So wow, like in every like dirty tactic you can think of, like giving people money, bribing them, uh, intimidating voters, like, and just of course the wanton violence. Like the mob's tactics worked, and the Christian Democrats triumphantly returned to power. Now the Christian Democrats, again, not a left wing or even liberal party; they are right wing anti-communist and religious nuts. The mob's tactics worked, and the Christian Democrats triumphantly returned to power. In his memoirs, William Colby, who would later become the director of the CIA, wrote that the communists would have gained 60% of the vote without the agency's sabotage. So, again, one of the first things I said when I started reading this book is that talking about Operation Gladio is another one of those big things where as soon as you start talking about it, just what the CIA has openly admitted to doing, you sound like a crazy person. And liberals who want to remain indoctrinated, they want to remain in the American nationalist bubble, but pretend that they are progressives, pretend that they are like the true left. They will not believe this. You can put this right in front of their face and they will just like close their eyes, or they will just say, "Oh, okay, oh well, what do you want me to do about it?" and make no connections to the mission or agenda of the modern day US intelligence agencies or what they're up to today, like what their agenda would be regarding current events that are often similar in nature. They will openly root for like neo Nazis in Ukraine and then act like stuff like this is not relevant. So the next section here, other Catholic banks. 1 year after the election, renewed fears of a communist takeover of Italy arose from Stalin's creation of the Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, so ComEcon, the economic union of the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, to enforce the Soviet dominion of the lesser states of Central Europe. Cool, cool. In the face of this development, the CIA opted to extend support for the CDP in Italy and stay behind units throughout Western Europe with billions in covert funding that could only come from the expansion of the drug trade. Hmm. So, yeah, they are not only, again, supporting the Christian Democratic Party, the right wing Christian Nationalist Party against the communists, but they're also going to fund and arm and support in every way these literal guerrilla terrorist militias made up of Nazis to hurt the communists in every way possible, like they had done in the 1948 election. Like we just mentioned, intimidating, murdering people, burning places down, and they're funding all this with the from the expansion. They're already starting it. They've already started it. They're already getting their money from there, but they have to now grow it, which is the drug trade, the heroin trade, selling it in inner cities, getting it from either legit pharmaceutical companies like Schiaparelli or getting it from uh, China was the I think place that they were getting it at the time, like Taiwan, and then it became Afghanistan later on. The stuff goes deep. Shibboleth says it's crazy how this happened over and over again in political history. The push of Western imperialism through NATO is a prime example here. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's wild stuff. The CIA funds were deposited by members of Don Carlo's crime family in Catholic banks throughout Italy, including Banco Ambrosiano. These banks, thanks to the Lateran Treaty, which established Vatican City as a sovereign state, were safe from scrutiny by the Bank of Italy and Italy's Treasury Department. A henchman for Giuseppe Genco-Russo, Don Carlo's immediate successor as capo, now observed, quote, he, meaning Russo, is constantly in contact with priests, priests go to his place, and he goes to the bank, which is always run by priests. The bank director is a priest. The bank has always been the priest's affair. So yeah, this is again talking about the Vatican Bank and how it's like one of the most secretive financial organizations in the world. This next section here is the Vatican Desk. In 1949, Pope Pius XII issued a solemn decree which excommunicated not only the members of the Holy Mother Church who joined or favored the Communist Party, but also all Catholics who read, published, or disseminated any printed material that upheld communist ideology. In an internal memo, the CIA provided the following analysis of the Pope's action. By this action, the two most powerful organizations for moving men to act on behalf of a doctrine are brought into open and basic conflict. The possible long range ramifications of this conflict cannot be easily or comprehensively defined. The decree will be a very powerful factor in the East West struggle. In Eastern Europe, it implies a struggle to the bitter end. In many other areas of the world, the decree will exert a powerful and prolonged indirect pressure on both policy and action. So, yeah, I mean, this is all, of course, very favorable. This is, like, of course, exactly what the CIA wants. Um, Super helpful to them. Continuing here. Communist governments and communists generally will have to accept the issue as now posed. Although the communist governments would obviously have preferred to carry on their anti church campaign at their own pace, the power of decision has now been taken from them. The conflict can be pressed on them with a speed and comprehensiveness that may well affect the satisfactory development of other communist policies. Some kind of typo here. Mm. Someone is fearful that the decree might be insufficient to crush the quote forces of godlessness. Pope Pius XII continued to tighten his ties with the CIA into a Gordian knot that no one could unravel. The CDP continued to receive more than $20 million in annual aid from the CIA, and in return, the CIA established a quote Vatican desk under Angleton. So, yeah, they have a whole section of their department of the CIA just for dealing with the Vatican. They're giving the Christian Democratic Party, the far right Christian nationalists, $20 million a year in support just to fight the communists. So again, this is all just to say, like, when people think that you're like a conspiracy theorist for suggesting that the CIA may have a hand in some kind of anti-communist agenda, whether it's in the media, in politics, in whatever affair it comes up in, like they openly do this. This is like their entire agenda. So people see people joining on Instagram. Hopefully it comes through on there. I don't know if it's like legible. I imagine it's probably too small to read on Instagram. But again, you can let me add the caption here. Sorry, I always forget to do this. That way you can, if anybody wants to check out the YouTube channel, that is YouTube/at TCOTE pod. Shibble says Reagan's war on drugs. Yeah, exactly. This is all involved. The Vatican desk reviewed all of the intelligence reports that were sent to the Holy See from papal nuncios or diplomats who were stationed behind the Iron Curtain. Okay, so any of the Catholic Church representatives that are behind the Iron Curtain are quite literally CIA assets. During the early years of the Cold War, this became one of the only means for the agency to penetrate the Eastern Bloc. Strategies between the CIA and the Church were drafted to undermine left-wing movements throughout Europe and South America. The affairs of politically suspect members of the Curia were monitored by moles. Okay, so any member of the Catholic Church, any of those like cardinals or whoever that were suspected of being left-wing would then be they'd have tabs kept on them. Again, like there's no lengths they won't go to. There's no lengths that they haven't gone to. Like they've infiltrated every tiny little organization because they have this infinite amount of resources. Like they have all this at their disposal to do it. So why wouldn't they do it? Especially since they consider everything left wing or communist to be that much of a threat, like an existential threat to them. The actions of progressive priests, particularly in Latin America, were thwarted by strong arm techniques. That's also footnoted. The next section here, the Knights of Malta. Angleton swore his allegiance to Holy Mother Church and became a knight of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, SMOM, the legendary ecclesiastical society dating back to the Crusades. Wow, that's the other thing about this too is like these people can have total nutjob fantasies that are based on like literal fantasy, like fiction. That they made. It's like it's made up shit. Like they've made up all this theology about some like historical characters, but like you attach the significance to it, and then you make that reality come true. And like QAnon is like the modern version of this. Like they have a total misunderstanding of the world from the outset. Like their base assumptions about everything are wrong, but because they're able to just enforce their will and corral so many people into it, they're going to create the reality where they end up doing violence on whoever their enemies are, and they're going to get away with it because I don't know, the left are doing what, like trying to fact check them. So the next section here, the Knights of Malta. Angleton swore his allegiance again. Okay, so I read some of this. Yeah, um, dating back to the Crusades. Okay, so the SMOM. Other spooks were also knighted, including William Casey, William Colby, and John McCone, who were all future CIA directors. It's wild too, like CIA directors getting knighted into the order going back to the Crusades. Um, General Vernon Walters, who would become the deputy director of the CIA under George H.W. Bush, Albert Caron, mentioned in the previous chapter, CIA Special Agent William F. Buckley, who would become the owner and publisher of National Review, Frank Shakespeare, the director of CIA media outlets Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, NATO General and future Secretary of the State Alexander Haig, and Wild Bill Donovan. All these people knighted into the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the legendary ecclesiastical society dating back to the Crusades. Wild stuff. Again, just like say this to any random person. Go ahead and just like screen cap this stuff, copy and paste it, put it into like an infographic form, make it catchy if you want, post it, and see what kind of like just meh reaction you get from liberals who regard CIA deeds as conspiracy theories. So, an SMOM knight of particular interest was General Reinhard Gehlen, who had served as Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front during World War II. So, good company of these CIA agents and right wing assets. In 1945, Gehlen had been asked by the OSS to set up stay behind units made up of fellow Nazis to spy on the Soviet Union. The units, known as the Gehlen Organization, eventually transformed into the these long German words, Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND. I don't mind butchering the German. That's fine. So the BND under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in 1956. Much of the business between the CIA and the Vatican began to be conducted at the annual gatherings of the SMOM in Rome and New York. So yeah, not only is this like an order for these guys to all get together, but that's literally where they're conducting their business and planning all their guerrilla terrorists, uh, militant misdeeds. Cardinal Francis Spellman presided over the proceedings and sanctioned future strategies against the communist forces in Europe in the name of the Pope. Since the Vatican played such an essential part in Gladio, William Colby, the CIA station chief in Rome, had microphones planted throughout the papal apartments so the agency could monitor the Pope's conversations and those of his staff. The snooping would persist until 1984. Ironic. Very ironic. Let's see. Yeah, I'll go with this one for just another minute or so. Schubel says, mind you, the Crusades is 1051 to 1291 as a time reference. Yeah, wow, they didn't know the years offhand. Thank you for that. So picking back up here, the Vatican now became a principal depository not only for black funds, but also top secret documents, including CIA files relating to the development of nuclear weapons. One of these documents, never declassified, surfaced in 2006 during the process of discovery in Alperin versus Vatican Bank, a class action suit by Holocaust survivors who claimed the IOR was the repository of gold that had been stolen from them by the Nazi Croatian government. And I mean, that's a real thing. Like, sorry, I don't know if we got into it already in this book or if it comes up later, but um, I'm pretty sure I thought like one of the original starting cash hoards that they use that they used to fund these operations and all this gladio terrorist shit was gold that they got from the Nazis and that the Catholic Church was holding. So that is the case, basically. I don't know how that lawsuit turned out. I don't know what the results were, but it they were right. I'm gonna bookmark it here actually, and then I'll switch over to the next book. Now we're going to switch to Western Marxism. This is the critique of the Western Marxist left, such as it exists, by Domenico Lacerdo, and then translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So we left off yesterday. I'm going to read this past paragraph because it picks up on that. It says, "Here we encounter the expression, quote, Western Marxism for the first time. It was not, however, contrasted positively to the Eastern kind. If anything, only in the context of a complex critique of Marx and communism could, quote, Western Marxism constitute the principal object. Once the initial hopes for a radically new society and for the, quote, withering away of the state apparatus vanished, one conclusion emerged. Excuse me. Quote, today's communism verges on progressivism, and progressivism cannot ignore the concrete conditions of the country or the area in which political action takes place. Done once and for all, with the messianic prospect of the total regeneration of humanity, it was necessary to go on a case by case basis. Where there is a choice between famine and the communist apparatus, the decision in favor of the latter goes without saying. And probably for the French philosopher, the decision went without saying when it was between colonial subjection and anti-colonial revolution, especially led by the communists. The West, however, presented a very different picture. Was the communist revolution really necessary and beneficial? And what would be its concrete results? This stance had many weaknesses. To better refute it, the French philosopher accentuated the messianic tendency in Marx and Engels. He did not consider that they speak of, quote, the withering away of the state, and sometimes of the, quote, withering away of the state in a strictly political sense. Only the former formulation can be accused of messianism and of anarchism. Second, Merleau-Ponty avoided interrogating the possible relationship between the end of colonialism in all its forms and the building of a post-capitalist society. Third, and above all, can we consider the anti-colonial struggle as an exclusive problem of the East? Hmm. To support the struggles against colonial and neo-colonial subordination, absolving those responsible for such policies would be inadmissible, and not only for ethical reasons. The two world wars had demonstrated that colonial expansionism flowed through ruinous inter-imperialist rivalries to have a global impact. The flames ignited a few years earlier by Hitler in his attempt to build the German colonial empire in Eastern Europe had ended by burning down the West as well, and Germany itself. Yeah, this is all just good info. I'm trying to see what he's leading up to here. Let me just check the chat real quick. So yeah, having made this criticism, the French philosopher deserves credit for being the first to have identified the objective socio-political reasons that led to the bifurcation between the two Marxisms. In the East, and in practically all of the countries where communists had taken power, the principal problem of political leadership was not the, quote, withering away of the state apparatus, but how to avoid the danger of colonial or neo-colonial subjection, and how, therefore, to make up for backwardness in relation to the more industrially advanced countries. Yeah, that's a really good point, I think. Um, if you hear people who criticize previous or existing socialist projects, they're criticizing it ostensibly, supposedly, from a position on the left, saying like, "Oh, it should be more anarchist. It should be more socialist. It should be less capitalist, less authoritarian." Whatever their criticism is, they have some ideal that they wish it would live up to, and that's where they're making their criticism from. But in reality, that is not their struggle. Their struggle is to keep their project alive and keep the colonial forces from interfering with them building socialism to the point of destroying their country, like literally turning it into um, a failed state. That is the goal of these imperialist countries. And we're talking about the most powerful empire in human history, uh, and its alliance with these other Western countries. And the amount of power they're able to exert, like, you can't understate that. And so when you have socialist projects like China standing up to that and being able to build the alliances that they've built to actually put a dent in Western hegemony, like, it's incredibly impressive. And it also just it makes the armchair left look really silly for making their idealist criticisms from the West, where they can't even build the first building blocks of socialism. Merleau-Ponty was far from disavowing Eastern Marxism in the name of the Western version. If we want to find a precedent for Perry Anderson's attitude, we must search elsewhere. Before the British and the French philosophers, Max Horkheimer in 1942 called attention to the turn that had occurred in the land of the October Revolution. The Soviet communists had abandoned, quote, the abolition of the state to concentrate on the problem of accelerated development of the industrially backward fatherland. It was a fitting observation, unfortunately formulated as a contemptuous condemnation. Yeah, that's a shame. It's one thing to say that and say like, "Hey, this is what they're forced to do." It's another thing to say like, that you did it wrong. Like, you guys fucked up." Again, like having not built socialism in your own country. The Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, and to regret or be indignant over the fact that the Soviet leaders were not worrying about how to realize the ideal of the withering away was grotesque. Hitler in his way would have shared such regret and indignation. The German philosopher did not realize that the behavior he reproached had enabled the Soviet Union to escape from the colonialist subjugation and slavery that the Third Reich sought to impose on it. The desperate struggle waged in the East to resist a colonial war of decimation and enslavement seemed irrelevant to a philosopher who appreciated not Marx's program of the revolutionary transformation of what exists so much as the pursuit of a remote future ideal of a society free of contradictions and conflict, and therefore without the need for a state apparatus. Yeah, again, it's wild. Like, it's one thing, like I was saying before, to be so hypocritical as to criticize the way that they're building socialism or not, having not done it, in your own country. But then also, when you take into account that they're literally fighting off the Nazis, literally fighting off Hitler and his armies who want to either exterminate or enslave them. Like, they literally view the Slavs, like all the Slavic people, as lesser and wanted to either get rid of them entirely or make them into slaves. And you're going to be like, oh, well, they're not building socialism enough, uh, ideally enough for me. It's quite literally the meme. Ink in the chat says perfectionism is the death of progress. Yeah. More than a quarter of a century later, Horkheimer returned to the theme of the abolition of the state, albeit referring this time not to the authors of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, but rather to Schopenhauer. On the one hand, he paid homage to Marx, quote, the time has come to finally make the Marxian doctrine, in the West, one of the principal materials of teaching. On the other, he expressed his annoyance with the idea that, quote, in many Eastern countries, Marxism serves as a useful ideology for making up the advantage gained by the West in industrial production. Yeah, why would you be annoyed at that? Like, that's a good thing. Unless you're just like actually an anti-Marxist. Like, so many people have just basically liberal views, like anti-communist views. If they see a communist project or socialist project succeeding, they hate that. It's the thing mentioned earlier in this book, like how they support the left and the leftist cause only so long as it loses. And then once it gains any kind of power, then they instantly begin criticizing it, fairly or not. The Marxian doctrine here celebrated. Sorry, the Marxian doctrine celebrated here bore no relation to North Vietnam's development of its productive forces, occupied as it was with defending itself against a barbaric aggression that was ready to use chemical weapons. Yeah, again, just like the wild circumstances that these people are subjected to, and to dare make these kind of nitpicky criticisms. Like, I can't think of a better term than that. Like, it's literally nitpicking. But nevertheless, Horkheimer indulged and even supported it. As in 1942, so it was in 1968. Utopia looked with disdain at the dramatic struggles in the East that were not a subjective choice but dictated by an objective situation. Yeah, they didn't choose to have to fight the West. But without recourse to this expression, Western Marxism had already turned its back on that of the East. We must ask, when did the bifurcation between the two Marxisms begin? With the rise of Stalin's autocracy, as Anderson maintains? And if instead we find it was already present the day after the turning point of 1917? And if the first cracks had already emerged when unity appeared as firm as ever, cemented by the chorus of indignation over the foul butchery of the First World War and the capitalist imperialist system accused of provoking it? And if the cracks and the subsequent alienation, beyond those of different objective conditions and cultural traditions, are because of the theoretical and political limits from the start of Western Marxism, that most sophisticated version, battle tested on the academic plane? Okay, so I really like this paragraph because it's a bit like wordy and like loquacious. Is that loquacious type? Is that the kind of guy you need? Um, it's incredibly sarcastic. Like this is very. He's really being mean here, and it's very funny. Um, Saying Western Marxism is the most sophisticated version, battle tested on the academic plane. That's fucking hilarious. Like I love that. He saved the best for last there. Uh, but the point he's also making is that like people will claim like they stopped supporting whatever version of Eastern Marxism they don't support or that they're criticizing. And if you trace that back, it's like, when did that start? Well, was it with Stalin? He's like the easy and most obvious like bad guy. Um, but then he's saying like if you just trace it back further, like it actually goes back to the 1917 revolution itself, to even World War One, whatever. Like he's just saying like there has always been this division. So it's not that again that people are like making all these criticisms from some like objective leftist position where they're just doing so out of like even idealism, like literally it's just based on their class position. It's based on the fact that they are just subjective observers of all this, and they're just not being honest. It would be like asking business owners to make objective criticisms of communism. It's like they're not going to do that. It was a long road to the manifesto in which Anderson proclaimed that the excellence of Western Marxism, finally liberated from the suffocating embrace of Eastern Marxism. A bright new life seemed to be on the horizon for the former. In fact, its premise was suicidal. We are dealing with important but largely ignored political and philosophical chapters of history that my book seeks to reconstruct, with the aim of also interrogating the prospects for a rebirth or on new bases of Western Marxism. Okay, cool. So now we're finally through the intro. This is like day 5 or 6 of reading this book 20 minutes at a time. And now we're on to part one, 1914 and 1917, the birth of Western and Eastern Marxism. So I guess that's where he's tracing it back to. So, section one, the turning point of August 1914 in the West. The history that I propose to reconstruct begins between August 1914 and October 1917, between the outbreak of the First World War and the victory of the October Revolution. On the wave of these two epochal events, Marxism experienced a global diffusion that projected it well beyond the Western borders, where it had been confined since the Second International. There is, however, another side to the triumphal coin: the encounter through culture, geopolitics, and economic social conditions among very different peoples stimulated an internal process of differentiation, with the emergence of contradictions and conflicts unknown previously. To understand these, we must interrogate the deep-seated motivations that led to one adhering to the communist and Marxist movements that took form in these years. Okay, gonna take a second to check the chat again. So, Shibble says, very utopian view here, rather than analyzing the conditions. Goes back to the feudalism and the Russian Empire. Yeah, there's so many of these trends that actually do go back hundreds and hundreds of years, which is why like it's just not surprising anymore. And when people like act like you're worshiping dead white guys from hundreds of years ago, or you're like worshiping dictators today, like that's a sure sign that this person does not know what they're talking about. They do not understand like how these geopolitical forces are at play, and that you are not playing great man theory. And so then they just accuse you of doing that because they have to reduce the argument to something they can understand. But it's actually good if those people continue to just have bad analysis, because then they will make all the wrong decisions. As I keep saying online, it's very important that liberals keep losing to the fascism, or else it would prove Marxism wrong. So, in the West, the radical, indeed apocalyptic historical turning point is undoubtedly represented by the scale and the flames of the First World War. The exhaustion, disgust, and indignation over the interminable slaughter promoted the rapid spread of the communist movement. What had already happened in Italy in the months or even weeks that preceded uh, the rise of the Bolsheviks to power, is symptomatic. Between February and October 1917, two delegates of the provisional government constituted in Moscow after the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy arrived in Turin to contact an allied country in the ongoing war and to counter rising pacifist tendencies. Before they had even arrived, the delegates made clear their hostility to the Bolsheviks, who demanded immediate peace. When Kerensky's emissaries appeared on the balcony of the Sakharty Palace, the crowd of 40,000 workers that had been waiting for them started shouting, "Viva Lenin!" That's pretty cool. That's cool shit. It was, to be exact, August 13th, 1917. 10 days later, barricades went up to support the anti war opposition, resulting in Turin being declared a war zone and the creation of military tribunals. Wow. I've never heard of any of this. We could say that the massive protesters and rebels joined the October Revolution before it had even occurred, and joined it on the wave of anti-war struggle. In our day, it is politically correct to speak of October 1917 in Russia not as a revolution, but rather as a coup d'état, except that we see the protagonist of this supposed coup provoke an almost revolution thousands of kilometers away before it had even taken power. I can't believe I've never heard anybody talk about this before. Nobody's ever talked about Lenin spurring all these massive protesters into this kind of spontaneous movement. This happened because his name and the party he guided were inextricably connected to an unequivocal condemnation of the war and the socio-political system accused of provoking it. That's cool. So, Lenin alone, I guess, is making the most critical or clearest critique of this war, and it provides him this opportunity because it is the most barbaric and horrific war that anyone has known up to that point. Um, it's pretty cool. He's able to spur all these people to an action because of that. The spiritual climate the spiritual climate explains the formidable attraction that the October Revolution exercised in the West, not only on the masses but also on intellectuals of the highest level. One thinks of George Lukács in his autobiography. He recalls, quote, "My interest in ethics led me to the revolution." This interest was one with his opposition to the war. He saw this opposition as constituted by the most elementary forms of morality. So I'm gonna have to just make this text a little bigger here. Give me a second. So, quote, "I was sharply opposed to it from the outset. My hostility to positivism was partly politically motivated. Partly politically motivated. For all my condemnation of the conditions in Hungary, this did not mean I was prepared to accept British parliamentarism as an alternative ideal, but at the time, I perceived nothing with which to replace the existing order. From that point of view, the Revolution of 1917 was a great experience since it made clear that things could be otherwise. Whatever view one took of this otherwise, it made a decisive difference to all our lives, or to at least the lives of a considerable proportion of our generation." Hmm. So yeah, I guess that's another way it can affect people's perception en masse. It's you can see things can be drastically different, even if that drastic difference and change in your entire society and global society as a whole, if that drastic change has been negative, that's one thing. But I guess it at least presents the possibility that you could also make drastic positive change. People don't seem to have that same kind of hope or vision in it at this point. Let me see how much longer I got. I'll do this one for another minute or so. Maybe I'll just check the chat actually. Shibble says people believe in a very small timeline viewpoint of history, as in 1917 was the end of feudalism for the Russian Empire, not 1500s or the 18th century but the turn of the century. Um, and she was also says, "What do people not read? Isn't this covered in what is to be done by Lenin?" Yeah, of course. People do not do the reading. Can you not tell? Mm. So I gotta block somebody. All right, you guys. So, analogously, Ernst Bloch writes, speaking of the young Hungarian philosopher and himself, quote, "At the start of the war in 1914, we felt completely lost. This war became a decisive factor in the development of each of us. For him, the link with the communist movement was both a support and a refuge. Even without forming organic relationships with the party and the communist movement on the plane of of ideas, the young German philosopher reached conclusions not dissimilar to those of the young Hungarian philosopher." Yeah, I'm just going to bookmark it here anyway. So now I'll switch you over to the Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. For anyone who is not caught up, this is what do I have to do? I have to like go to this guy's profile to like. All right, we're just going to have to tolerate this guy being annoying in the chat for a little bit. Sorry. All right, so this report discusses the deceptive nature of quote fat tail distributions. How likely, for example, are we to experience a catastrophic 6 degrees Celsius warming of the globe? Well, the mean warming predicted by models is about 3 degrees Celsius, and the standard deviation about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the positive tail, defined as the plus 2 sigma limit, is about 6 degrees Celsius of warming. The likelihood of exceeding the amount of warming isn't 2%, as we would expect for a bell curve distribution. It's closer to 10%. So there's some charts that accompany this, like bell curve charts. Again, hard to relay over audio form. Risk is computed by multiplying the likelihood of an outcome by its severity. IPCC reports have not given attention to fat tail risk analysis, in part because the reports are compiled using a consensus method. Again, more charts to accompany that. The authors of this paper, titled, quote, Climate Science Needs to Take Risk Assessment Much More Seriously, ask the question, why did the IPCC not long ago produce a risk assessment like that of King and others, 2015? From the conclusions section, quote, for decision makers, climate science is a problem in risk assessment and risk management. It is therefore surprising that the needs and lessons of risk assessment have not featured more prominently in the consideration of priorities for physical climate science or in the major IPCC assessment reports. This state of affairs is a result of the siloing of climate science between different disciplines, but it has been exacerbated by a widespread view that the job of the IPCC is to provide predictions and projections with a focus on likelihood rather than risk, and that risk assessment is a job for others. Yeah, so I'm not sure what relevance that has to the conclusions that they're drawing, but again, just like a reminder that the IPCC had started with the false assumptions that net zero by 2050 is possible, and then they base all their conclusions off of that, and then also rule out any outliers that seem too drastic to begin with. So the King 2015 risk report quotes a 2012 UK Food Research Partnership report which concluded, quote, the evidence is not available properly to describe with any certainty how variable weather will impact on food production systems, and worldwide trade. But our contention is that we need greater investigation of what they could be, with perhaps greater consideration given to reasonable worst case scenarios, given that the frequency of weather extremes is increasing. The potential for large impacts, and unprecedented ones, is growing. King's report concludes, quote, the risk of a serious weather-related shock to global food production appears to be increasing rapidly due to climate change. Such an event could have serious implications for the stability of global grain markets and human security in vulnerable countries. First and perhaps foremost is to better understand the risks. In particular, we need to better understand the evolving risk of weather-related shocks. Yeah, and I think another conclusion to draw from that is like when you take the individualist mindset and you say, how do we prepare for this uh, possible collapse of the biosphere that results in food production not being able to happen, like mass shortages of food? The individualist approaches this with a prepper mindset and buys buckets of dried food, stocks up on stuff. Um, the collective mindset would actually do that on a country level, would like do some kind of preparation or actually try to combat that in some way, even if you had to go with like, I don't know what you would even do, like some kind of underground farming or some kind of way you can produce food on a mass scale that like doesn't require relying on the ecology being like ideal for doing that. But either way, you're going to be much more successful at that if you tackle that on a state level. Like you could literally have a socialist country as opposed to a bunch of individuals just trying to do it by themselves. So the takeaway from this section is that no one is taking risk assessment seriously. The IPCC is not doing risk assessment. The few individual researchers taking the time to investigate are basically saying, we have no idea how bad a worst case scenario could be. It is beyond ridiculous that we stand less than 18 months from crossing 1.5 degrees Celsius, and our risk assessments boil down to more research is needed. Yeah, so not good, folks. Section 6.2 Food Supply. There are two distinct vulnerabilities to our food supply: distribution and production. Yeah, I guess we don't think enough about distribution. Distribution is also just as important as the production itself. So, section 6.2.1 Food Distribution, that's going to address that one first. The primary near term threat to human civilization is famine. Americans may think of famine as something that happens elsewhere, not here. This is a mistake. Go to your kitchen cupboard, grab a few items, and look at where they're made. Try the same exercise at the grocery store. Capitalism has forced the hyperspecialization of various regions into profitable monocultures, which create single points of failure in the food system. Yeah, that's a very succinct way to put that. People have often been talking about the intentional creation of monocultures and how places that often grew a lot of different crops and were self-sustaining were forced by first world organizations like I think it's usually the IMF that does that kind of thing into growing like a single crop because it's profitable for another first world country, usually the US or England, to like sell. And then that results in like them having awful famines. It's basically the same as like the Irish potato famine model. So just one example, 90% of the green leafy vegetables produced in the US from November to March are grown in the Yuma, Arizona area. We import beef from South America and fruits from all over the globe. Staple grains have become just another globally traded commodity like steel or rubber. What this means is that practically nowhere in the developed world, and most especially not in the US, can people support themselves on locally produced foods. Farmers markets are in no way capable of offsetting a major gap in imported foods. We are completely dependent on a highly complex global logistics chain in order to eat. Oh, and this is a great one. Somebody has it's the framed efficiency or the famed efficiency of capitalism. Someone's holding just a cup, like those little plastic single serve cups of pears. They're just like chopped up pears in water, and it says pears grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand, and it shows that on like a world map how it just has to go across the world twice for no fucking reason, other than it's like the difference isn't like the cost of labor that incentivizes people to do that. So Sybil says it's why we're here today is to not read. Also true. Yeah, I mean, if this gets some of the word out to other people in a little easier way, great. Ships also says no way distribution and production. If they were worker owned, we wouldn't have monopolist problems. Yeah, of course. And reminder: the mass production, industrial agriculture, and livestock is the largest contributor to methane emissions globally. Yeah. So let's see. We've seen in recent years what can happen when that supply chain experiences even minor shocks. Beginning in 2020, we experienced a wide variety of product shortages from Chinese factories closing temporarily to protect workers from COVID. We saw massive price spikes on lumber, which lasted 2 years. We saw crops destroyed as distributors couldn't rapidly switch from restaurant supply chains to grocery store supply chains. From April 2020, quote, farmers are dumping as many as 3.7 million gallons of milk each day. A single chicken processor is smashing 750,000 unhatched eggs every week. Yeah, that's that efficiency of the markets and the free hand. The highly comedic 2021 grounding of the container ship Ever Given in the Suez Canal caused supply backlogs. Of course, it's not, those are all not the free market. It's the government telling people to respond to an outbreak and an epidemic. But what is the capitalist solution to that? It was like the government that tried to do the only reasonable thing, which was lockdowns. And look how that was responded to by the market enjoyers. Sorry, excuse me. So in this interview, and there's a link there, George Monbiot discusses complex systems theory, and its relation to the vulnerabilities of our food supply. Some important quotes from the interview at a minute 58. The global food system is beginning to look very much like the global financial system in the run up to 2008. It's become unbelievably concentrated. According to one estimate, 4 companies controlled 90% of the global grain trade. And those same companies are becoming vertically integrated as well. They're buying into seed, into chemicals, into machinery, into packaging, processing, retailing. They're massive and they're highly interlinked. Your system, this is at 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Another quote: your system is likely to be resilient if no particular nodes within it are dominant, if those nodes are quite weakly connected to each other, and if their behavior is not synchronized. Because if that's the case, shocks can't easily be transmitted throughout the whole system. They stop. There's some sort of circuit breakers within that system. Yeah, it's a very good point. You want to have some kind of decentralization, even if it's among your centrally planned production. At 4 minutes and 25, another quote: if you have these super dominant nodes, they become very strongly linked to other super dominant nodes, and they all begin operating the same way. That is a highly fragile system because one thing goes wrong in one node, and it can bring the whole lot down. Another good point. Yeah, I'd actually much rather hear just the pull quotes than have to watch this whole video. So at 5 minutes and 5 seconds, quote, what we're seeing now is these enormous nodes developing not just big corporations, but also these sort of super exporter nations, particular ports through which the food is passing and particular choke points. So a huge portion of global food trade goes through the Suez Canal, or the Panama Canal, or the Straits of Malacca, or the Turkish Straits, or the Bab el Mandeb, or the Straits of Hormuz. And you only need a couple of those to go down, and there's very serious trouble. It's not hard to see how the food chain could snap. Yeah, it just reminds me of like the Houthis and their operation against against Israel, and how much like global trade they were able to hold up and literally make the prices of things go up uh, just by launching their homemade rockets. It was wild to see. So now it's 6 minutes and 20. Commenting on shipping infrastructure improvements, quote, you think, oh, well, that makes it more efficient. So that's good. It makes our food supply more reliable. Surely. This is emphasized and bolded here. What that's done is to enable companies to switch from stocks to flows. So they don't hold stocks anymore. It's all just in time. So if that chain snaps, suddenly there isn't any food. Basically, the world's food stocks are at sea at the moment. That is our food stock. Yeah, it's all just the stuff on the container ships. And if that gets jammed up for some reason or another, or if the ships don't get loaded in the first place, then instantly that chain is broken. And not only are people going to go hungry immediately as the shelves will just empty overnight, but also you can then see a chain reaction going on through the whole food system, which is exacerbated by speculation. There's massive financial speculation in food now, When they bailed out the banks, you can do that with finance because you can borrow money from the future. You can't borrow food from the future. That's hilarious. That's a great way to put that. Yeah, it's also just really bringing home the point. Like, I remember when COVID had hit, and that was like one of the main conversations in all the media and all the political sphere. Like, people were talking about just in time infrastructure, and they're talking about how even hospitals had gotten to the point where they only had enough beds and rooms to cover what they expected a mild surge to be. So they were not at all prepared for COVID. And that resulted in the deaths of a lot of people who would have otherwise been okay had they had some medical attention. This is in first world countries. So at 7 minutes and 40, quote, it literally keeps me awake at night. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh Christ, the food supply, this can't be true. But I've been reading these scientific papers now, going back 10 years, saying, quote, governments, you need to be aware of this. This is really, really scary. This is worse than you can possibly imagine because if this goes, and everyone's ignored it, it's been completely ignored. So yeah, very panicky tone here. Not good, folks. As I continually say reading this one, not good. So section 6.2.2, now onto the food production. So that was all just the distribution. That was all just talking about getting the food to where it needs to be, let alone being able to grow it. So in spring of 2022, after Russia launched the Ukraine offensive, World Grain Market watchers were concerned about the inability of Ukrainian farmers to harvest and transport their winter wheat crop to shipping ports for export. Ukraine produces 9% of the world's wheat exports, among a number of other important agricultural products. India stepped up, announcing, quote, we already have enough food for our people, but our farmers seem to have made arrangements to feed the world. That's very cool of them. How nonchalant. I also remember, wasn't this like around the same time that the Indian farmers went on like a massive, like millions of people wide communist led strike, like literally waving hammer and sickle red flags. And then, of course, the Western media completely ignored that. So Modi said in April, quote, we are ready to send the relief tomorrow. Now those lofty goals have been abandoned and wheat exports banned as life-threatening heat waves in South Asia stunt output and push local prices to record highs. The move shocked international markets on Monday, all the more since it came just days after India assured the world that the unprecedented heat wave wouldn't impact its export plans. Hmm. This is only one recent story of many. I highly recommend following Jim Baird on Twitter or Mastodon. Baird, a pseudonym, claims to be a Canadian agricultural industry expert and regularly posts global agricultural news. This thread contains a trove of news articles spanning years. Skim through that thread and you will quickly realize just how lucky we've been recently, how many near misses are happening regularly. The most likely event to trigger a civilizational collapse is what is referred to as a multi breadbasket failure. From King's Risk Assessment, quote, food production of the globally most important commodity crops, maize, soybean, maize is also corn, maize, soybean, wheat, and rice comes from a small number of major producing countries. The exposure of a large proportion of global production of the major crops is therefore concentrated in particular parts of the globe. And so extreme weather events in these regions have the largest impact on global food production. Is emphasized here, simultaneous extreme weather events in two or more of these regions creating a multiple breadbasket failure would represent a serious production shock. However, understanding the covariance of extreme weather events in different production regions is currently under researched. There is an urgent need to understand the driving dynamics of meteorological teleconnections, such as the El Nino, which may be becoming more extreme, in order to quantify the likelihoods of coincident production shocks in major food producing regions. So that's all just to say, like, it's another one of those not necessarily a feedback loop, but just like a cascading event where you can have something triggering something else, and then it just leads to these massively tragic events that we are just not prepared for. Shubal says, I wouldn't know this without you. Appreciate it. As long as it's getting out to somebody. Essentially, if one region experiences a major crop failure, that is not the end of the world. Damaging weather events happen all the time, and there is enough supply to handle a one off regional catastrophe. Simultaneous crop failures are a different matter. As noted in the previous subsection, we do not keep extensive food supplies in storage. Many foods would run out within weeks of the onset of a significant shortage. It is not inconceivable that a significant breadbasket failure could cause 500 million deaths in a single year, including far more deaths in the US than often thought possible. Additionally, demand continues to increase. Quote, and this is bolded here, demand for food at a global level is increasing faster than yields are growing, leading to increasing pressure on land. Demand growth is driven by population and demographic change and increasing global wealth. All right, so I'm at an hour. I think even on the stream timer, yeah, I just hit an hour. So I'm going to bookmark this one here. Because that last part especially just reminds me of that, like, who was that quote that said, they said, like, humanity depends on basically like a 6-inch layer of topsoil. So yeah, unless they figure out a way to like really produce some nitrates and reinvigorate the soil with nutrients that it's been losing from factory farming and all the farming the way it's been done, that's definitely going to be another choke point. But I'm going to guess that's going to be addressed in the section tomorrow. So, all right, so we're on page 80 of 119. So definitely send suggestions in the chats for other books to pick up on once these are done. So then join the daily live streams on YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, and I believe it's also on TikTok as well. So